Okay, so the Mrs.p skin quest has been out for a couple weeks now, and I still don't have it, mainly because of school and I just suck ass the game. But anyways, this quest also came with lore, which pretty much just tells us the backstory of Mrs. and Mr. P, as well as finally answering the question that everyone has been asking for the past 5 years, and not even the greatest detectives knew the answer to this question. What exactly happened to Mrs. P? Specifically, what happened to her during the outbreak? The only information we had at the time was that Mr. P let her wander off because she became infected, as well as her silhouette being in the city chapter, and people just speculated that she's been hiding there the entire time. But now we have the skin quest to answer all the questions. The only problem is that we have to put it in order and line them up for the storyline to make sense. Now the secret notes pretty much just summarizes Mr. and Mrs. P's love story before and after the infection outbreak. I'm going to add in small details so it can line up with the storyline. And keep in mind, these are not confirmed dates, these are just small details I wanted to add in. We first start off around the 1940s to the 1950s. Mr. P meets Mrs. P for the first time in school and hopes they can become friends later on, but instead they become lovers. Fast forward a couple years, in the 1950s, Mr. P decides to propose to Mrs. P to become his wife. A couple more years pass and it's the early 1960s. Mr. P opens his carnival and is struggling to stay in business, but luckily Mrs. P is a doctor, so she can support both herself and Mr. P. Some more time passes and the carnival finally becomes successful, meaning Mr. P can finally have a stable income thanks to Mrs. P's support. Over time, Mr. P becomes more wealthy to the point where Mrs. P no longer needs to work. The problem is, since there's not many doctors in Lucella, she has to keep working as a doctor in order to help others, which doesn't bother her because she likes helping others. We later fast forward a couple years into the 1970s, where Pig 64 comes into place, and where Mr. P becomes a famous celebrity. But anyways, a company which is most likely protection services through mechanics and machines has been struggling because they don't have their CEO, which is most likely Mudson, and this could also tell us what happened during Pig 64. But anyways, Mr. P eventually does help the company by buying a part of the company, which could explain why he has access to advanced technology in Book 1. A couple years pass and Mr. P becomes the well-known billionaire potato we all know and love. But unfortunately, Mrs. P becomes ill with a disease called lilioma. Mr. P spends 40% of his own funds to research facilities around the nation to research a cure for this rare disease, as well as getting volunteers to test the supposed cure, Substance 128, and Mrs. P is one of them. And well, this causes the infection to break out, and Mrs. P gets infected, but Mr. P didn't have the heart to stop her, so he let her go, and Mrs. P later went into hiding in one of the buildings of the city chapter. Fast forward a month into the infection, a group of people came to find Mrs. P, capture her. Now, who could this group be? TSP? The Capitol? Or a new organization that could probably change the entire Piggy storyline forever? It's the military. It doesn't take that much brain power to figure that out. Trust me, I've seen a lot of people overthink about this note and who this group could be. But anyways, this could also take place when the player is knocked down in Chapter 6. Mrs. P was taken to the plant and put in a secret lab in the cave system. The reason I think of this is because it would have taken weeks for the cave to be made, the same amount of time the player has been locked out in a hospital.
And around that time, Substance 128 starts to change Mrs. P, not only physically but also mentally as well. Since Mrs. P was already weak because of her disease, she barely had control over her body, which is why she is locked up in an underground lab. But later the player breaks her out of the lab, which leads to a boss battle. After the boss battle, both Mr. and Mrs. P share one last memory before Mrs. P wanders off, and Mr. P and the player experience the true ending, and it's possible that after the true ending, Mr. P went off to find his wife to hopefully find a cure for her, since he has access to multiple research facilities and advanced technology, finally ending Book 1. So in conclusion, this is what truly happened to Mrs. P. But anyways, thank you so much for 2,000 subscribers on YouTube. Honestly, I can't thank you guys enough for the support you've been giving me for the past 4 months. Now, I'm sorry if this video came out late, like weeks late. I had my reasons, but I'm good now. Also, I'm on winter break, meaning I have more time to work on more videos, so expect a couple videos this week, like 1 or 2. Honestly, I thought this channel would slowly die because of my horrible upload schedule, but you guys proved that wrong, so thank you. But anyways, subscribe for more Piggy theory, and like always, have a good rest of your day.